Hey, how's it going guys? This is Dave2D and this is a video on the Asus UX306. So last year, Asus came out with the 305. Great device. It's actually one of my favorite Asus devices from last year. It was actually one of my favorite Ultrabooks from 2015. But this is the successor. It's been upgraded across the board. Let's take a look. The exterior is very similar to the 305, essentially the same shape and size. The top surface has that radial brushed finish again. The bottom is the more standard texture. To open it up, you need to remove the T5 screws, and then there's two more screws under the feet. It's kind of troublesome to get in there, but once you're inside, you'll find a removable M2 SSD, and then there's 8 gigs of RAM which are soldered on. There is an option for 16 gigs of RAM if you need it. Now, compared with the XPS 13 and the Razer Blade Stealth, it's the biggest of the bunch, but it's still a relatively small package. It has the same amount of material flex as the 305 from last year. I know it looks pretty dramatic on camera, but I'm twisting this thing pretty aggressively. The chassis isn't as rigid as I'd like it to be, but the overall build quality is good. The hinge tension on the screen is perfect. You can open and close it with one hand, but the bottom of the screen hits the table when you open it up. So the 305 had little feet that kind of helped it keep it off the table. Those feet aren't on the 306, but I don't think it's an issue. The edge doesn't seem to scratch my table. It's a little skimpy on ports. There's one USB Type A, an audio jack, and an SD card slot. And on the other side, there's a USB-C, micro HDMI, and that's it. There's one USB-A, one USB-C, and the USB-C port doesn't even support Thunderbolt 3, so not a ton of ports, but it should be enough for most people. The screen looks to be the same as the UX305. This one here is the 1080p non-touch screen. It's a matte finish. Viewing angles are okay, not amazing, but it gets bright at around 320 nits, and the color accuracy is pretty good. There's an HD webcam up top. This is what it looks like. The speakers are still located on the bottom, but they sound better this year. They're not super loud, and they still don't have a lot of bass, but they sound clear, or at least clearer than how I remember the UX305 one sounding. The keyboard has backlighting now, which is something that I know a lot of people wanted on last year's model. It's pretty spacious to type on, the arrow keys are small, but the layout is good and none of the keys feel uncomfortable to use. The keystroke isn't as responsive as I'd like it to be. It's supposedly a 1.5mm travel, but it feels shorter to me, and I'd say overall it's a pretty average but decent typing experience. The trackpad has been improved. The earlier UX305 units had a weird clicking issue. That's been resolved. It's a big plastic surface and it uses native Windows drivers, so tracking is really good. I wish the texture was a little bit smoother, but there's no skipping, and the buttons and the gestures are also really responsive. The SSD that they include is a SATA-based M2, so it's not super fast. System performance otherwise is good, more than capable for any kind of work you do on this. It's running the Intel HD 520 graphics chip, so gaming isn't its strong point, but lighter games are still pretty playable as long as you're running on the lowest graphics settings and the lowest resolution. So even something like Overwatch can hit 50 or 60 frames per second as long as you don't mind the pixelation. The performance here is a really nice step up from the Core M chips that some of the earlier UX305 shipped with last year. And also, if you want, 1080p video editing is viable, just make sure you're using an external drive. In terms of fan noise, it's very quiet on idle, not quite silent, but it's close. On load, the fan noise picks up, but it never gets super loud. Thermally, it has a pretty average heat output. It features something called Asus Ice Cool, which supposedly keeps the palm rest cooler, and it does, but I'm not really seeing that much of a difference between this and any other Ultrabook, to be honest. The battery life has been bumped up. It's a 57 watt-hour battery, and it takes around 3 hours to charge, 7.5 hour battery life, maybe a little bit less depending on what you're doing. Okay, so the Asus UX306. It's an aluminum Ultrabook, well built, similar to the UX305 in shape and size. The 1080p screen is good, but it's not a touch screen. The keyboard is respectable, and the backlighting is a nice addition this year. The trackpad is improved and uses native drivers, which is nice. The dual-core Skylake i7 is more than enough for anything you'd want to do on an Ultrabook, and it's well cooled without being too loud. The 8 gigs of RAM are soldered on and can't be replaced. The 512 gig SATA M2 stick can be replaced, but it's not easy to open up. And finally, we have a battery that'll last you around 7 hours of regular use. So I really like the UX306. They essentially took the 305 and fixed the two biggest problems I had with it last year. They added a backlighting for the keyboard and they fixed the trackpad. Now, it's still not a perfect device. I wish it had Thunderbolt 3 and I wish there were more USB ports, but aside from that, I think Asus did a fantastic job on this device. It's definitely my favorite Asus Ultrabook available right now. That's the end of this video. Hope you guys liked it. Thumbs if you liked it, subs if you loved it. It's been nice. I'll see you guys next time.